The following tutorial is going to explain how to write a scientific report which can be used across a variety of science units. First thing we need to do is understand what goes into a scientific report. Each report that you do will have its own unique features, so it's important to go through your marking criteria, particularly your academic discourse section of your marking criteria to ensure all the content and structure points are actually ticked off. So when looking at this marking criteria, it'll always have a number of elements that you need to actually complete in order to obtain a passing grade. That means that you can do other elements of this extremely well, but if these elements are not ticked off, you will not obtain a pass. So first things first, let's go through some of the key sort of core concept components that are required to achieve a pass. Usually, and I'll start with the introduction, the introductions tend to require basic background information. Examples of that can be seen in this report on the screen with things like this first sentence. It says, following exposure to stimulus, protocols systems require preparation. That's just a basic background statement. Same with this next statement. It says reaction time is universally accepted index. Again, very much definition based. It's just explaining what the typical topic is. So even without a heading, we can see that the topic of this particular scientific report is a Hicks law report. So things like reaction times in there, talking about the number of choices, and so on. Now you can see that this is taken from the McGill textbook, but this one here down here is like a journal article. So to just use a journal article for basic background information doesn't necessarily get you any more marks if it's used in that purpose. It is good, however. It does tick a particular box, which is up in the higher order of things of using sources from a variety of text types. So it's definitely useful to get background information from a number of different places. So an example here would be a textbook. You could use a number of textbooks, or even better than that, you could get information from journal articles as well. So you can see introduction is going to have a lot of background information, so it's a really good time to use things like a textbook. But a textbook, remember, is just a summary of information that's out there, so you're not going to be able to get many specific scientific examples from that, because it doesn't tend to talk about the actual results from experiments. It'll just lay down basic information about a particular topic. So definitely introduction is going to have a lot of this. Now the more you put in of this, it's good to have. Yes, you can use it, but it tends to not get you much more of a pass than a pass. And it'll probably push you up into the higher level of pass if you've got a lot of different sort of supporting background information from a lot of types, but you're still not going to get much beyond that. Other important elements that we see in introduction are things like providing relevance of a topic. So things like where it'll say something like, here's an example here, we've got when presented with a stimulus, reaction time may be influenced by an array of factors, and then it talks a little bit about the factors. So that's not a definition, but it's something that shows you how this might influence like a real world type example. So it's more so saying the definitions are here, this is when and how it may impact on society or in a practical based setting. You can do that a number of ways. You could also go ahead and write something like, for example, this may impact this particular setting. That'd be another good way of supplying relevance to a topic. We're seeing more and more now things like lit review tables being included in introductions. This is an example of a lit review table here. Now, often with a lit review table, to obtain a passing grade, you just need to provide one. Marking criteria don't tend to talk about how many elements need to be in this, but just that it needs to be there. Generally, they have author, participants, methods, findings. You can have other categories in this as well, but notice the language used here. It's just very simple. It's almost point form format. The author, done in shortest possible form. So even though it might be sort of the first time we've seen it, you don't need the extended versions here, and it's just basic one or two sentences saying what the general findings are or the general methods and so on in there are. Now, you could keep this brief and you wouldn't be penalised in this section. However, it can do two things if you really bolster up this the lit review table. Number one, it does add to the more general background information, which again will push you up into that higher level of a path. But this information is really going to be useful when it's time to do the discussion, which is later in the majority of scientific reports, because this is where you're getting your information from to compare your results with. So the more you can do here, the better assignments will have at least 5 more, and really the rewards of doing a good job here will show up later in the reports. Another basic element which you'll see at the end of all introductions are when it says states a purpose of the report, and usually this purpose is based on the comments made before that. So in the example in this particular report, the last sentence in the introduction will say something like, therefore the purpose of the investigation was blah 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 blah. Very important statement, because it's setting up why you're doing this report in the first place. And notice the sentence preceding that was based on the collective findings, blah blah blah, therefore the purpose of the report. That's showing you that you've arrived at the purpose based on what you've written before it. So the information before it is giving you some specific examples. It's talking a lot of background. This particular introduction here is done quite well because it's ticking some higher order boxes, which are things like providing specific examples from the literature. So anytime you see specific, we're looking for actual information from a scientific study. So the example here, we've got in a recent study, such and such examined whatever, whatever, whatever. That's a specific scientific example. You can see that's more than just a definition comment. Yeah, this particular person is using a journal article for what makes it good, for what makes the journal article actually different from the textbook, which is information from a particular study which they're going to later talk about or compare with their own findings. So this introduction has got up here, it's got some basic background information. It then goes on to say what the relevance of the topic is. It's down in this section here, it's providing specific examples. So it's, it'll say in a recent study, the findings, these findings have not been reported in all studies, so it's showing you a variety of studies and where there might be a little bit of uncertainty about what the results are showing, which ultimately leaves them to the collective findings demonstrate, therefore the purpose of this investigation. So sometimes marking criteria will say something like, you consistently need to provide scientific examples. Anytime you see the word consistently, what it's referring to is each time you talk about a new topic, providing this in a recent study, da 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 da. It doesn't have to be a recent study, it's just a recent study in this example because it's within the last year. But if I brought up another topic in my introduction, to maintain consistency in this specific scientific example, I would need to find another study which has examined exactly that. So the only other thing I'd like to comment on is when it says in marking criteria, you need to demonstrate relationships or links between your key elements. So what that refers to is that each paragraph has got something to do, or it's linked in some way with the paragraph before it. So an example here, we've got this statement right here, and generally we will see these linking statements at the beginning of each paragraph. So the paragraph before it says you've got two such influential elements may influence our results, and then the next sentence down here in the first sentence of the second paragraph will be the observed relationship between these da 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 da. If you actually read both of these sentences, they're highly linked. This one's here is throwing out what the two things are, and this one here is saying how we might use it. So then when I roll on to the next section of the paragraph, this paragraph here is linked to this paragraph here because our statement in between does that. It's bringing up an example of where this previous statement actually is put to use in the literature. So we'll scroll down to the next section in the majority of scientific reports, which is the methods section. Generally in the methods section you've got a number of different key elements would need to be addressed. Things like equipment, you might have subject information, and almost always they'll have some kind of experimental protocol. So with the subject information, that's another way to say that same thing is participants. It's just talking about the participants that were used in the actual investigation. If, for example, you did the experiment on yourself, you might have one student or one participant, one athlete, depending on who you're using. If it's done in a group, you might have 10, 20, you might even have a couple of hundred different participants participating in a study. So describe the people or the person you're using or have used as best you possibly can. Equipment. This section here could be as brief or as long as required, depending on how much equipment is used. This particular equipment is quite brief because it was just a computer-based program where the participants sat at a computer screen and sort of clicked the button depending on what was happening on the screen. So not a lot of equipment used. In this instance, because they were using a computer, the idea is to describe the computer as best you can, or the software as best you can. If you're out in the field doing something, you'd be describing the types of equipment, like the balls or the bats or whatever it might be, whatever you might be using. Really, those two elements are quite short, they're quite easy. Avoid point form, so we're looking for short paragraphs or sentences. Generally, a paragraph would be 3, 4 or more sentences. In this instance of the methodology, you might not get 3 or 4 paragraphs written about a participant, and that's fine with methods. Methods can be quite short and succinct. With things like experimental protocol, this is probably the most difficult part of the methods. It's talking about what do you actually do. So the idea of an experimental protocol, and this one's quite long, it goes down a couple of pages. What you're aiming to do in this instance is explain to someone who wasn't there, who didn't know what you did what you actually did. It's like someone could read this and repeat the experiment as if they weren't there at all. So you really need to be as detailed as you can be to say exactly what actually happened in this experiment. Often in the superior end of marking criteria, it'll say things like adding supporting information or supporting details to add to the procedural detail. So that's saying anything that you can add to this section which showcases what you're talking about, so the reader can understand what you're saying, will help you achieve a better mark. So in this instance, this particular person here has got different figures showing the arrangement of what was seen on the screen and what they actually had to do. So it's talking about when this happens, you need to press this, and so on. Remember that every time you have a figure, you need to refer to it. So you can't just plop a figure in the middle of your words. You would need to say, example here would be see figure 1. Notice the small s, that's how you correctly write it, small S-E-E, but a capital F because it's the name of something, it's in brackets. Another common mistake there is the full stop goes outside the brackets. There's several methods you can use for this. This is just one, but in every instance it'd be the capital F would be the key feature there people are missing out. When you're labeling a figure is always labeled below, so you've got the bold figure 1, and then in the lowercase writing what the actual title you're given to it is. It's just you're looking for a title that makes sense. There's many ways you could title that. It's anything that just has the reader understanding what they're looking at is going to be fine. The other thing you'll notice here when you look at the methods is the language. Language is very, very important in the methods section, and often this is where people will fall down. The two important language elements are to be written in third person and to be written in past tense. So notice third person, notice the language used in this. It says each subject, or it's talking about the participant you'll read quite often. It's not saying I, me, we, you. It says the participant, the subject performed this. In other words, even if it was you doing the experiment, you're writing it as if it's someone else, or as if you were a fly on the wall watching the actual experiment taking place. The other important element of this was the past tense. So the subject was told, as in it's already happened. Often when you're reading experiments, you're basing it on something you did either at the time, or maybe it's written in your lab book. they're written in different kinds of tense. Often when you get instructions, it'll be written as in this is what you need to do. Past tense meaning it's already been done. So when a circle became illuminated, like it's already happened, the participants were required, which means they've already done it. You're writing as if it took place at a previous occasion. Sometimes in methodologies it'll ask you to use scientific justification as to why you use the methods that you've used. Now often in a methods section you'll be sort of piggybacking off previous methods that are used. Now you can never use say your lab book or your instructions from class as an example of specific scientific research, because that's not a specific scientific research source. The example here we've got in this first sentence says the experimental protocol used in this study was similar to other previous Higgs law computer-based experiments, and it's got two different studies that have used similar computer-based programs. The idea behind doing something like this is to have the reader feeling or showing that you haven't just made up some program that's not a valid method of to assess the experiment that you're actually trying to assess. You can't in other words, you are using it off known reputable sources. This is standard procedure for experimenting or to calculate what you're trying to investigate in the particular study. The final thing I'll comment on in the methods section is where it says things like linking to the scope of the report. Now the idea behind linking to the scope of the report is things like nothing's new here. It's not out of the box. What are we all of a sudden talking about? In the introduction for this section, it was talking about the purpose of the experiment is to use a computer-based program to investigate whatever it is you're investigating. And now here we're saying the experiment, the program used was like this, and this is what it looked like, and this is what it did. That's just a classic example how linking to the scope, meaning each part has got some kind of relevance from a previous part. So in this instance, in the introduction I was setting up the type of experiment I'm going to perform, and in the methods I'm explaining that actual experiment. So one section has got links to the previous section. So the next section in every scientific report is the results section of the scientific report. Scrolling down to the results section. Okay, first thing is a results section will include figures and or tables of all key findings. So in other words, it's absolutely essential that you've got some tables with some raw data in it. In this case I've got two tables, table 1 and table 2, and some kind of figure showing what my findings are in a graphical representation. And usually starting with the key findings, often there's many findings. So the first instance we're talking about the most important finding. So the key finding of this, or the primary finding, is this. Now, if you're ever going to include tables and figures, firstly we'll just discuss they need to be correctly both labeled and also cited. So the correct labeling of a table is written above the actual table, capital T, table 2 in this instance, and that's written in bold, and then you've got lowercase thereafter. So table is always above, and it's presented above the table in question. A figure is a little bit different. The figure, as I mentioned before, because we saw some in the methods section, is written below. So here we've got figure 4 written below. Again, that's in bold, capital F, and then small case underneath. These are done on a one spacing line with a hanging, which means the A and the S are directly on top of each other. This S wouldn't be over here on the edge, and you wouldn't have a double space between them. When you're labeling axes, units always where you have units, you need to include them. And you've got this rotated text up on the y-axis, this on the x-axis, a legend explaining if you've got more than one data set. No grid lines, no borders. This is the absolute appearance we're looking for. Also notice that there's not a use of color in this area. We're using symbols to tell the difference between our two series. You can use essentially shades of black and white, so greys, dotted lines, dashed lines, all acceptable for this area. Now that doesn't, we'll go up to the text. Now for whatever reason people think just putting a table and figure in is often all you need to do in the results. The table and figures are there to supplement, to show the reader what it looks like graphically, but you still need to state your results. So where it says state your results, in this instance there's two sets of results. Said the results of both the high and low responses were da 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 da. These are presented in table 1 and table 2. That is an example of citing. So you can't have tables or figures anywhere unless in some instance you're saying here is where it is. And again, you'll see the figure. There's a figure, see figure 4 written at the end of the sentence there. Another example of citing it. So if the marker or the assessor was to come through and not see these written here, you would essentially lose marks. So first thing, we need some text saying what your actual results are. Secondly, we need tables and figures. Third, tables and figures need to be both labelled and cited correctly somewhere in your text. So that's the basic results. The next thing you need to do here is to number one, talk about your findings, but talk about them with some kind of specifics. That's the key to getting the superior mark in the results. So not just saying the general, which is, when this happened, that happened, but actually breaking down my results. Here you've got an example that says specifically an increase of this resulted in a 23.5%. It's got some 27% increase. I've got a lot of numbers here. I'm showing what my actual results are. Now you can do this many different ways, but the idea here is you're actually doing some kind of calculation of what your results show, not just the general overall vibe. When this happened, when that happened. It's breaking down specifics. I'm saying these were my times or these were my increases. I'm actually putting the numbers in. We see it here is quite a few here. It's got some actual results. I've got some results from the trial. This one here is taken from this 4-choice trial. The 4,945 is comparing that with this number down here. Again, a lot of reference to what my results are actually doing. So 40% higher, 45% higher reaction time compared to da da da. In other words, this person's gone to the trouble to work out that this is 45% higher than that, and then discussed it or stated what the results are. So the only other thing I'll comment on in the results is sometimes in reports it might say compare your results to other findings. In this example here, it's compared the two different results that this person's got from their experiment. This is a high compatibility example and this is a low compatibility example. So I've got my legend indicating the two. I may have done that on two separate figures, which is fine as well. I may have a third series with maybe some data from someone else's experiment. If I've recreated another experiment or I've done something very similar, then maybe I'll put theirs on here as well. I could break it down if the actual numbers aren't the same. In other words, they wouldn't fit on this axis. Maybe I'd look at percentage increases or decreases of the actual results I have with the results of another experiment. So there's many ways you can do this. This one here is just a one figure example. You could have 2, 3, 4 figures demonstrating the differences between these variables. Okay, so I'll scroll down now to the discussion section of a scientific report. Arguably the hardest section of the report, because there's a little bit more literacy in this element, this section, compared to other elements of the scientific report. So we'll start by thinking about what is part of the key criteria to obtain a passing grade. The first thing you need to do is state what your key findings are. Remember that there's almost always more than one finding. So most experiments have got several different things that you can look at within an experiment. So always look for your primary findings, so your most important, but then there tends to be at least another set of results in there somewhere as well. Second is compare, contrast the key findings. So using actual scientific literature. In this instance, where it says scientific literature, we're talking about things like peer-reviewed journal publications. So what I need to find is some scientific literature, some other journal articles that have experimented, not necessarily the same experiment, but they're trying to investigate those same concepts. And I'm comparing the results that I found with the results that they found. That's probably the most difficult thing to do, and I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. And then we've got to conclude. So there's tends to be an overall conclusion which talks about the collective findings. And when I use that word collective, I'm meaning the discussion now is talking about my results in the body of a much bigger results, which is what I found, how that relates to the other material, the other literature on the particular topic, and then the overall consensus of my finishing point. Either yes, this is all in agreement, or it's still some conflicting results, or for whatever reason your experimental data doesn't fit the mold of what others out there have shown. So I'll start with going through what each of these elements look like. So here we've got, starts off with a definition. You don't necessarily need to start with a definition. You may restate your results. You may readdress the purpose of the investigation. But the idea of this kind of opening statement is to link it with the scope of the entire report again. So in this particular example, it's saying Hicks law states, and it's going through what Hicks law is again. Then the findings are, boom, see the findings of the present investigation. Now that you're comparing your results with other results, it often gets confusing whose results you're talking about. So we avoid that by saying the present investigation or the present experiment, meaning the results, your results. That's what that actually means. And then the other of investigation or previous investigations is the language that we use to describe other people's results. So here I've got the findings of the present experiment are in line with Hicks law, showing and whatever they showed. So essentially that is a restate of the results. And remember that if I'm restating results, I need to refer to my table and figures again. In this instance, those results can be found in that table, so that's all I need to refer to. Now I reach the more difficult part. Now I'm looking for this comparing and contrast to what my actual findings were. So the way I can do that is the next sentence says there are a variety of studies examining Hicks law, so I'm already identifying that there's many out there. Remember, if you use the word variety, it's talking about more than one, so the reference for that section would need to contain more than one. I couldn't say there's a variety of studies and then just have one reference, for example. And then I narrow it down even further. One such investigation did this. So this guy Lee et al. Did a particular thing. And then I talk specifically about what he found. So that's an example of taking an actual study in a couple of sentences, breaking down what he did, what he showed, and then highlighting the similarities or difference. So in this instance, they're similar. So you see this word saying, further similarities are observed. In other words, that's me comparing my results with another. In this instance, they're similar, maybe not always. Maybe there's some part of it that's not. So one notable limitation, meaning there's something different in it. And then I've described, or in this example, it's described what the differences are. So we're looking for language here. We're looking for things that say it's similar, it's different, it's comparable, no contrast. These are all linking words that compare and contrast your findings with another previous experiments. Now, where am I actually getting this information from? These experiments that I've talked about here, this is from that lit review table that we discussed earlier in the introduction section. So again, if I've done a very good job of that lit review table, now it's paying dividends. So now I'm able to easily find this information. And the words that are written here is basically the longer version of those point forms that were, those dot points that were found in that lit review table earlier. Now, one study, in this case I've just used one here, that's not really, a great compare and contrast. It's, you're certainly getting some good marks there, but a good discussion will contain multiple studies looking at a number of different elements. So here we've got, again, a link. Similar results can also be seen, and yet another scientific study which examining the same type of thing. In this case, it was done on some participants with the neural disorders, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and so on. So there's going to be some differences there straight away because the population they've used is quite different to the population that you might have used. So somewhere down here, it'll actually draw attention to that. Increases in this study were far greater than those in the present study. So I've been talking, when it says this study, it's the study I've just been talking about. Far greater than those in the present study, meaning your study. These significantly greater increases may be attributed to. So what I've attempted to do here is explain, I'm explaining why there might be a difference between the two. That's difficult to do, but if there is a difference between your data and someone else's, the idea is that you're trying to express why this might have occurred. Again, you're not saying things like, I think this and I think that. You're actually using facts from the data which may present differences between the two. So this significantly greater increase may be attributed to, and then you're working out some kind of differences, again written in third person. Scrolling down here, we've got yet another difference. Similar results were also presented by, and another article comparing, contrasting. Reaction time was presented in a parallel manner, meaning similarities. Again, I'm lining up, showing where the differences are, where the similarities are. This collectively, the results of the present study were in line with Hicks' law. So what we're saying here is a bit of a wrap-up statement. It's saying, from everything I've read, all of these, I've mentioned 3-4 journal, specific journal articles up through this section up here in these previous paragraphs. Everything appears to have a similar trend. Some of the differences, the magnitude of the numbers might be different, but the same things tend to happen. So here there's a closing statement that says, collectively the results of the present study were in line with the other experiments, indicating da 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 da. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all experiments tend to have more than one set of results. And in the instance they have more than one set of results, you're going to have more than one thing to discuss. See, and that's where we bring in this section here. It says the experimental results also revealed 45% higher reaction time during the low compared to the high. So this is a completely different set of results. The first 3 paragraphs was talking about the increases in this high compatibility situation. But now I'm talking about a low versus high. So I've compared the high with the rest of the literature. Now I'm saying the difference between my low and high. You're basically repeating the same process again, but now I'm trying to find journal articles and specific scientific examples which showcase other people that have looked at the differences between two elements. So I've got a journal article here, it's looking at the same thing. I've got specific numbers, there's numbers in there like that. The results show this is a different number to my one, but the increases are still the same. The results are consistent with the increase. So I'm using these words consistent, I'm using similar, but I'm talking about the nature of the differences. And then I explain a little bit further. It says, despite a similar trend in the increase in the 2 investigations, one was significantly greater. And then I go on to talk about why it may not be significantly greater. So again, I'm comparing, I'm discussing the differences between these 2 elements. The other thing this highlights is the links between my sentences and my paragraphs. Remember as well, like it's always going to be in those sort of superior marks. It'll say you need to show links. This is an example of a link. It says despite a similar trend. So where this has come from is up here. That says the result are consistent increase, but the actual numbers are different. So this is here saying the results show a similar kind of thing happening. However, the magnitude is different. The actual numbers are different. So then the first sentence down here says despite a similar trend in the increase between these 2 investigations, and then it goes on to talk about another specific signing. So that there is a link. It's sort of crossing over what is in the previous paragraph. The other thing that this paragraph initiates, or it's actually this paragraph back here initiates, is more than one theme. So often it'll talk about themes within a discussion. So the first theme we had was it was comparing the high compatibility model with other high compatibility models. And now I'm comparing a low compatibility with a high compatibility. So whilst they're related, I'm now talking about a different theme. I'm talking about a different set of results. So anywhere that you read this term, variety of themes, or you need more themes, what it's referring to then is it's saying you need to just talk about more than one thing. You need to talk about another facet. The other thing you'll often find in a discussion section is the criteria will often say something like you need to draw evidence-based conclusions. What evidence-based conclusions are is it's referring to based on what you've just written, based on the results you've seen, you're going to pull something out of that. So here, this paragraph here talked about similarities between the experiment data that you have versus this other experiment data from this other study. And it talks a little bit about the nature of the change. And then at the end it says, collectively the results of the present study are in line with other experiments, indicating that when this happens, that happens. So when increased reaction time, you get, through increased choices. So what this is saying, this is an evidence-based outcome. It's saying that based on not only one study, two studies, more studies, see collectively it's taking into the studies preceding it, that this happens. That's what we call an evidence-based conclusion. It's saying based on the findings that I have just found, I've read, I've written, I've compared my results to, this is what happens. So it's not my opinion, it's based on the results that are presented in front of me. Again, it's important to remember that when it says you need to link to scope of the study, what it's referring to is in some way that you're bringing back information from previous sections. So the easy way to show that in this particular discussion is, again, it's restating the findings of the present experiment are this. That's bringing back a previous section. That's bringing back the results section with my table and results. That's just one example where you can say this discussion is linked to the scope of the study because it's got something to do with the study or the paper that was before it. The other thing, again, we saw it in the introduction, whenever it says consistently provides specific examples, it's saying that if I bring up a particular topic or theme, I've got some scientific evidence to back it up. I've found a paper, I've talked about some scientific data which actually shows this somewhere in my report. If I talk about some results and I don't back it up, but I've backed up other sections, that's an example of providing scientific research, but maybe not consistently. So wherever possible, you can provide research evidence. You're always going to obtain superior marks for that section. Okay, so looking at the reference section, a lot of different scientific reports will actually address the reference section differently. Actually, before I get to that, I'll just comment on a conclusion. You need to have a conclusion at the end of your discussion, and the conclusion is concluding all the key areas that you've discussed. So in this instance, I've got my two themes that I've been talking about. I've got the theme of the first results. So the results in the experiment are consistent with Hicks' law, showing reaction time increases with more choices. I then also have said, based on what I've seen, that whilst this happens, it doesn't always increase logarithmically. Because where I've gotten that from is, I mentioned a lot of different sort of areas in the discussion that showed an increase, but I showed that the numbers weren't always the same. So in the conclusions here, I'm saying, yep, there is always an increase, however, the numbers are always a little bit different. The next part it says is, the present results also showed an increase in, this is my second theme. So it's saying the results also showed this, talking about my second series of results, and what that might be based on, or what the collective research appears to be in that. So again, in a conclusion, you're readdressing what your one or more parts of your results are, and you're also sort of restating what that consensus is across the different journal articles that you've read, the specific scientific examples. When I look at my results, my reference section. The reference section is a couple of key elements, and check with your referencing guidelines to ensure you do this properly. But they need to be in correct APA style, and not just throughout. So you'll get marks on here with how they're actually in text reference. So things like this, is this done correctly? Is that done correctly? And again, depending on what you're writing, those criteria might be a little bit different. Also, that this actual list is done correctly. So you've got the italics in the correct spot, you've got the correct language, it's indented in the correct manner with the hanging. It's also alphabetical order. You really want to make sure these features are done correctly, because every part of them is you get graded on. Where it says consistently, let's say the whole thing was done correctly. Yes, we can see that you've done it correctly, but maybe there's a one or two little mistakes. That's the difference when something says consistently correct element or just correct. So if you've done it majority of the time is all correct, but there's just one or two little mistakes, it's still okay. When there's no mistakes and the whole thing is exactly as it should be, it's perfect, you'll have something written like consistently correct, correctly done. Now the last thing I'd like to discuss is the overall formatting of the document. Now you want to look at your marking criteria for presentation and formatting, because sometimes they're a little bit different. But what you'll notice, and I'll just scroll back up to the top as I'm talking about this, you notice a couple of different things. First of all, the line spacing. So 1.5 to 2 spaces, generally acceptable, whatever's written in your criteria. So the way that we can do that is highlighting the section, maybe highlighting the whole thing, and clicking on whatever it is. This one here is double space, so I click 2. For 1.5, I click 1.5. The next thing I'll discuss is where it says text justification, and what that's talking about is the margins. Notice in this it's got straight down one edge, it's also straight down the other. This is called the margin justified, or justified evenly on both sides. The way to do that is you highlight your text, and it's these functions up here. So in this case, it's the one with the straight edges on both. Most of the time you'll have started like this. All you have to do when it says text justification, you make sure both sides line up like that. Page numbers, right? Ensuring that your page numbers are always clearly presented, the bottom right hand column. You'll find that if you go up to your insert tab, it's got things like page numbers right here, and you go bottom of the page and it'll show you where you can add them into your headers and footers. The other thing, we've got clear headings. So the headings are written, you don't need any big lavish headings. They can even be written in the same font type and size, but just something that distinguishes the difference. In this instance, the whole thing here is written in font 12 Calibri, with this heading written in a bold font 12 Calibri. That's all you need to do. So again, look for what's being asked for you in the font type, but the main thing is consistency. You don't want to have different font types and different font sizes throughout the document. The whole thing needs to be consistent. Probably the best one and the most common one used now is that font 12 Calibri, unless you're otherwise asked. Remember, and this one doesn't have it on this particular element, but when it was, if it's an online submission, it needs an online cover sheet, and you would always have a title page, your name, your student number, and the actual title of the report written on it clearly. One final thing I'll comment on is word count. Now, all scientific reports have a very strict word count. When you're dealing with a word count, remember these couple of key features. Anything that's presented in a table, anything that's in a figure, any kind of calculations, any reference lists, even references in text, does not actually count towards your word count. So it's not as simple as just highlighting the whole thing and hitting word count, because you'll have a lot of features in that don't count towards your word count. So just keep that in mind. Word count doesn't include tables, doesn't include figures, doesn't include what's in your appendices, doesn't include your reference lists. And that should allow you more room and space to write the appropriate amount within each section. So that's the end of the tutorial on the scientific report writing. My closing message is really the whole thing is about making sure that you've met the criteria from your marking criteria. So you've actually addressed the key elements. Remember that the way criteria are written is that you can't get the superior grades if you don't contain the basic key elements required to pass this submission. So the first thing you need to do is read your academic discourse criteria, ensure that every single key element is met as a starting point. Addressing the key elements is a starting point. So they don't have to be fantastically written to pass, you just need to address each of the key points. Then, almost like a checklist, you work your way from a pass right up to an HD, making sure that each of these areas is met throughout. There's no point in starting up in the HD trying to do the more complex things if those basic elements required to get a pass aren't there. So, closing statement, make sure that the key criteria is met, and then work your way up from that pass right up to an HD, essentially self-marking your own assignment.